You load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. That's a blast from the past, isn't it? Last time I quoted a pop song here, it was Taylor Swift. Today it's Tennessee Ernie Ford, or at least that's the version I remember. It's a song that goes back to the 1940s about the plight of coal miners in Kentucky. Working hard and never getting ahead, exploited by a system rigged against them. You load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. I thought of that song this past week as I was reflecting on the gospel, and it occurs to me to wonder what those old Kentucky coal miners might have made of the story Jesus tells this morning. To most of us, the parable Jesus tells is a vexing and perplexing story. Commentators variously describe it as incomprehensible and difficult and confusing. One calls it Jesus' weirdest parable. Part of the problem for us is we expect stories that offer simple lessons about the rewards of hard work, perhaps, or the virtue of always telling the truth. But that's a fable, and Jesus doesn't often tell fables. He tends to deal in parables. Jesus uses parables to invite us to imagine God and one another in new and sometimes unsettling ways. Parables challenge the status quo, undoing and overturning conventional thinking, turning the world upside down in order that things might be set right. Which is why I thought of that old song. Kentucky coal miners would have loved to have seen the world turn upside down in order to be set right. That's my way into this morning's gospel. You load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. As you see, that was the world in Jesus' day as well. That was first century Palestinian economics. It all starts with the Romans and their occupation of Israel and Palestine. The Romans came, they conquered, they exploited the natural resources, and then they exploited the people, imposing taxes that were especially harsh on the working poor. The poor tended to live on small farms in the northern part of the country in Galilee. Those with wealth tended to live in the south, in the religious capital of Jerusalem. Galileans in the north and Judeans in the south, they shared a lot. They shared a culture, they shared a religion, but they were also separated by geography and wealth. And when those poor farmers in the north fell behind on their taxes, as they inevitably would, the wealthy Judeans from the south swooped in. They took advantage. They paid back the back taxes owed by their Galilean family members up north in exchange for deeds to the property. They'd allow the farmers to stay on in their homes, but only as tenant farmers now. and their rich benefactors would expect a percentage of the produce from the land as rent. And then those wealthy Judeans from the south would turn the oil and wheat and grapes grown by the poor farmers into bread and wine that they in turn could sell to the Romans for their banquets. And so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Mind you, this harsh economic reality, this harsh political reality didn't need to be explained to those listening to Jesus. They knew it, they lived it. And that makes Jesus' story about economics. It's about more than that, sure, but first, it's about nothing less. Jesus begins his story with these words: "There was a rich man." I suspect we think we're supposed to understand that a rich man, a landowner, in any parable is an automatic stand-in for God. That's how most parables go, right? Well, maybe that is true for most parables. And I should allow that maybe the rich man in this parable is a stand-in for God, but then again, maybe he isn't. Hear me out. Let me back up and provide some added context. Last week, if you were here, you heard Jesus tell two parables about lost things, a lost sheep and a lost coin. The very next story, if we had read on, would have been the parable of the prodigal son, which is really a story about a lost child. So 3 stories about lost things. And Luke told us in those opening verses of last Sunday's gospel why Jesus was telling those stories. The reading began this way: "Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Suggesting that Jesus is telling those 3 stories, one right after the other, to rebuke the grumblers. Jesus insists to them that God sees the value of people that the religious elite dismiss as lost. Just as a shepherd sees the value of a single sheep, as a woman sees the value of a single coin, and a father sees the value of a lost child. But Jesus didn't stop with those 3 stories. He continues after 3 stories about lost things this morning with the first of 2 more stories that immediately follow those other 3. All 5 stories belong together. Jesus doesn't take a break between telling these stories. He hardly takes a breath. He tells 3 stories about lost things and those who are content to write them off, and then Jesus goes on to tell 2 more stories, starting with the one we heard here this morning, and both of those next 2 stories begin the same. There was a rich man who... Again, we're likely to think that the rich man is God. But before we settle on that answer, consider the rich man about whom we'll hear more next week, who is decidedly not about God. Next week it'll be, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen. In that story, we'll hear about that rich man who lives in wealth and comfort, failing to see Lazarus at his gate. A rich man who is blind to human need on his doorstep. That's not God. Which is why I'm not at all sure that the rich man in this morning's gospel is a stand-in for God. And then there's this. For just after this morning's gospel, one verse after the end of our reading this morning, and sandwiched between these last two parables about rich men, Luke tells us this: the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and scoffed at Jesus. The Pharisees, the rich man, they take offense. Jesus has touched a nerve. So I've come to think of today's parable as a story about actual rich men and the impoverished people who work the land and provide wealth not for themselves but for the wealthy landowners. And it's a story also about the intermediaries caught between the manager. In Jesus' story, a rich landowner accepts an accusation against his manager that he'd been squandering the rich man's property. Assuming the worst about everybody, he concludes that the manager isn't squeezing the farmers enough. He's not getting what he should from those lazy, ungrateful farmers. So he fires the manager for not getting sufficient return on his investment. The rich man, you see, isn't interested in any explanations or excuses. And in that moment, I wonder if the manager experiences a moment of blinding insight. If he sees for the first time, perhaps, the way the world works and the part he's played in it. I wonder if he sees his boss, maybe for the first time, now that he's been thrown out with the trash, treated no better than the tenant farmers. He sees that his boss only had him held in any esteem based on what he added to the bottom line. So he ponders his options. What will I do? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. And I wonder if in that moment of stunning clarity, he comes up with a third option. I cannot work, I will not beg, but I know how to use the system that has used me and abused my neighbors to set things right. And he resolves to stick it to the man. He'll use the system for good rather than ill. He calls in those with debts too large to pay and negotiates new terms. He forgives debts the debtors cannot afford. He gives a break to the poor. Once upon a time, he acted in a dishonest way to enrich his employer. Now he acts to enrich others and thereby establish a relationship of mutual benefit. That makes the story Jesus tells less about someone who is a cheat and more about someone who suddenly sees through an economic system that enriches the wealthy, protects privilege at the expense of those who have no power in that system. He's a whistleblower in action, shrewd enough to figure out how to take steps to help those who need it most. And that makes this gospel story a critique of first century political and economics, a system that leveraged the poor for the benefit of the wealthy. In truth, it still offers a critique of any status quo that benefits some to the impoverishment of others, a critique of our own economic system that devalues people, attributing no intrinsic value or worth to them, any worldview that says the value of a person is to be found merely in the wealth they generate for someone else. In its context, it's easy to see how this is a deeply disturbing story for some. For those invested in the status quo and the accumulation of personal wealth at the expense of others. but it's also this. I think the story Jesus tells might just be a wild and hilarious fairy tale for others. For debtors, the hard-working people just trying to get by. The kind of thing you load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. Maybe in God's economy, a person can catch a break, can enjoy some human dignity. In the pithy statements that follow this story about a rich man, Jesus explains we'd better learn that money isn't the ultimate measure of things. We'd be way better off using our wealth in service of God and in service of relationships between all of God's children instead of using people in pursuit of more money. Love God, Jesus says throughout the Gospels, and everything else has intrinsic value. For everything and everyone is precious in God's sight. I am reminded of one of the stories told about St. Francis, how he came to see himself as a spoiled rich kid and saw the need all around. So he emptied his father's warehouse of the wealth stored there. His family dealt in linens and clothing. He emptied his father's warehouse of all that wealth. He took it to clothe the poor he saw all around. Well, his father was outraged. He took his son before the local judge, and the local judge sided with the father, agreeing that Francis had stolen what wasn't his. But the people sided with the saint. And so on this occasion, Francis removed his clothes and handed them back over to his father and walked away. Augustine of Hippo once observed, God gives us people to love and things to use, not things to love and people to use. Original sin, in his estimation, had something to do with our tendency to confuse the two. God gives us people to love and things to use, not things to love and people to use. Or as Jesus insists, you cannot serve two masters.